Jimmy Carter was a Southerner who had a different style about him, and people thought they could really like him, especially because of America's predicament. They were just desperate for just kind of a restart. The 1970s hadn't started off well, and by the mid 70s, they were doing even worse. So many people looked to Jimmy Carter, but found him to be kind of inflexible and a bit self righteous in many different ways. To address mounting stagflation and inflation, he took the typical approach, the Keynesian approach, of increasing public spending and cutting taxes in order to help with the economic condition. That's typical Keynesian economics. That's what's happening today in our pandemic era. We've gone on a spending spree for stimulus. That's what we did in 2008, 2009 during that recession. Spend, spend, spend your way out of a downward economic time and recoup maybe some of that upon better times. Okay, fair enough. Um, the problem was inflation continued to skyrocket because no amount of public spending or tax reductions could overcome the idea that OPEC has put a chokehold on oil prices. So energy prices remain sharp in increases by OPEC, and inflation would raise oftentimes at over 10% per year. The typical inflation rate you want to see, a sign of inflation that's pretty good, that your economy is doing well. You want to have a little bit of inflation. That's normal. And a typical inflation rate that's usually a sign of good times is somewhere between 2, 3% maybe, somewhere around there. So if you have 2.5% inflation, but your gross domestic product has increased by 4%, then you're outpacing the inflation. You're doing very well. So that would be the ideal. So if you're growing at 4% and inflation's only growing at 2.5%, you're ahead of the game. Great. Problem is, like I just said, growing at about 10% inflation. So one of the ways that economists at the Federal Reserve try to negate a lot of that inflation is to decrease the amount of money that can be taken out in the form of credit and loans. And when you raise the overnight interest rate, generally speaking, people aren't going to want to borrow as much money because it's going to cost them a lot more in order to do so. This caused mortgage interest rates to approach the upper teens and even around 20%. So think about it. If you were to buy a house, take out a mortgage, today's interest rates on a 30-year fixed loan, conventional, somewhere between 3.5% and 4%. That's amazingly good. These are great times for mortgage interest rates. Okay? 1978, 79, 1980, late 70s, you're looking like 19%. That's the good interest rate. Think about trying to buy a house on a 19% interest rate. If you're paying 19%, that means you're going to be able to buy a lot less. You're not going to be able to buy as much because it costs you a whole lot more. That's going to further cripple the economy. Okay? People aren't buying as many homes when they have to pay an arm and a leg for it. I used to work in the mortgage industry, and in the early 2000s, about 7%. If you got about 7% on your 30-year fixed, that was considered really good. Then after 9/11, things really started to dip on down. And if you got an interest rate in the fives, that was great. And then the 10-year Treasury bond had its ups and downs, stimulus and things along those lines. Eventually it would go into threes. If you had great credit, you can get 3.5% on a 30-year fixed. That's great. Okay, that's a lot better than 20% in the late 70s. Okay, and there are various different reasons for it. Otherwise, though, Jimmy Carter did espouse many of the 60s civil rights era mentality, and he gained a lot of favor from Hispanic and African American voters because of it. And he wanted to expand various different things, that enacted civil rights acts, and part of that was a show of force in actually putting minorities into his cabinet, minority women at that, like Patricia Roberts Harris and others of the sort who would go into his cabinet. So even though they didn't really benefit much from his economic efforts, they still minorities still largely saw Jimmy Carter as being somebody who would go to bat for him, if anything else. Okay, so he remained popular with black and Hispanic voters at the time. And along those human rights lines, Jimmy Carter was very successful at a couple different things. Um, he does seem a bit controversial for his efforts to relinquish power and authority of the Panama Canal back to the Panamanian government. You see, we talked a number of chapters ago in the Progressive Era about how Theodore Roosevelt had garnered the support in combination with various different independence movements, most notably Panama and their independence movement from Colombia. Um, in the early 1900s, Theodore Roosevelt garnered the support for the United States to build and control the Panama Canal, which linked the Caribbean Sea, part of the Atlantic Ocean, across to the Caribbean Ocean. Or I'm sorry, the Pacific Ocean, rather. Okay. Um, so the United States maintained power and control over it. We built it. We funded it. Okay. Well, over the course of the decades, many in Latin America, and especially in Panama itself, had kind of grown weary of the United States, especially as you had many pro-Marxist movements from various different areas of Latin America. They didn't like how the United States had control over a territory within a sovereign country in Latin America. So you had a growing resentment and mistrust of the United States because of it. Even though we built it, we funded it, okay. It was becoming increasingly obvious that something was going to have to happen in relation to control and power over the Panama Canal. Jimmy Carter was successful in eventually negotiating with the Panamanian government and then therefore relaying it on to Congress, which would very, very narrowly pass in the Senate, to negotiate a treaty that would relinquish total control of the Panama Canal back to the Panamanians. The difference was, in the treaty, we would relinquish control as long as we were able to have basic free reign use. So it wouldn't be our canal anymore, but we can use it. Okay? Now, that was in 1979 that treaty was ratified. And on December 31st, 1999, the Panama Canal would be totally relinquished unto the Panamanian government. So that happened. You know, you have this whole Y2K thing going on. We'll talk about that. Okay, you got Y2K. And then Panama Canal goes over. 20 years later, the United States still maintains effective use of the Panama Canal. We just don't have control over it. If the Panamanian government had a severe issue, they could tell the United States, sorry, hold off right now. It's important for us to maintain good relations with Panama. But otherwise, though, that was one of the things that Jimmy Carter negotiated. The re-establishment over control of the Panama Canal unto the Panamanian government. Okay. Also going around this time, in the prior video I talked about how Egypt and Israel had negotiated peace, basic settlement of disagreements without violence. That was under the Ford administration with Henry Kissinger as Secretary of State. Probably the best thing that Jimmy Carter's presidency is known for was the Camp David Accords, which took what happened with Kissinger and Ford a step further. Because Kissinger and Ford negotiated the Sinai Peninsula going back to Egypt in exchange for nonviolent resolutions. The Camp David Accords negotiated largely with Jimmy Carter's work, helped produce a formal recognition of Israel by the Arab state Egypt. Many, many countries in the Middle East and many people do not want to assume the legitimacy and relevancy and rightfulness to exist that the state of Israel has. Okay? The Camp David Accords produced an official peace agreement and an official state recognition of Israel on behalf of Egypt. That's huge. And considering OPEC and how they created many of the embargoes and the pricing issues, that was considered huge. To this day, a lot of the Middle East doesn't recognize Israel. And if they do, it's extremely contentious for various different reasons. Okay, we'll talk about some of that later. Otherwise, though, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty became a hallmark for Jimmy Carter's human rights movements and the things that he did to help Israel gain international acceptance by also promoting peace with other Middle Eastern countries. Okay, that was a nearly impossible feat, and he was largely successful, and that's one of the great things that he did. Outside of that, though, the Jimmy Carter era was also marked with a possible reformalization of ties with China. We're going to recognize each other, and we're going to establish formal diplomatic relations. We're going to try and open up trade. And in doing so, we also want to talk to the Soviet Union about renegotiating the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty that was attempted years prior, which would limit the number of nuclear warheads throughout the country, throughout the world, rather. It would help promote nuclear peace. Okay, hold that thought. We're about to talk about where SALT II fails. Going on that year, 1979, in Iran, there is a growing resentment of the Shah of Iran. The Shah had been in power for a few decades, and he'd been an authoritarian figure that many people did not like back in Iran. The Shah was also pro-West, and he was pro-Westernization of Iranian culture. He really promoted the idea of Westernizing Iran. For many various different Shiite fanaticals, that was too much. They didn't like his authoritarianism, and they didn't like how he wanted to Westernize Iran. And the most ardent supporters of the religious movement fought very hard to remove the Shah of Iran. And political pressure grew so much that in January of 1979, the Shah of Iran fled Iran to the United States. And a few months later, a religious leader, a Shiite, zealous religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, anti-West, he is anti-United States, and he demanded that the United States hand over the Shah back to Iran. See, the Shah fled Iran and came to the United States. More specifically, he came to New York City. He had cancer and was seeking cancer treatment. The Ayatollah demanded that the United States hand him back over to Iran. Shortly thereafter, in November, in the Iranian Revolution, you had an armed crowd that stormed the American embassy in Tehran, November 1979, and they seized various diplomats and military personnel. 53 Americans remained hostage, or were taken hostage. And they were taken hostage for exchange of the Shah of Iran back to Iran. That didn't happen. And for over a year, those 53 Americans were held hostage by Iranian revolutionaries. Okay? Not long after that, just a few weeks later, in December of 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Okay, so the Soviet troops invade the mountainous Islamic nation that's just south of the Soviet Union and just to the side of Iran, just to the east. And they install a Soviet backed government there in Afghanistan. Now, there are various different reasons why, there are various different conspiracies as to why the Soviet Union invaded Iran in the first place. They wanted to extend their influence in the Middle East, perhaps because of oil. Perhaps they were trying to eventually make their way down to the Indian Ocean and perhaps take over Pakistan. Various different reasons and rationale remain as to why they may have done it. Fact of the matter is, they did it at a time where Iran was very vulnerable and when the United States was still struggling from an economic standpoint. Um, Jimmy Carter believed it was Russia trying to obtain control over oil supplies. Perhaps he was right. Okay. And he proclaimed it to be a threat to world peace. And he disavowed the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan so much that he would impose various different economic sanctions upon the Russians. He would cancel the United States' involvement in the 1980 Olympic Games held in Moscow, the capital of Russia, and he would also end negotiations for SALT II. The nuclear armament treaties, they're now all bets off. Okay? So, the 1980 Olympic Games, America's not going to participate in Russia. Imagine that if you were an Olympian. Yay, politics. Nuclear threats, well, they're back on the table, baby. Okay? And you start to reinvigorate some of that old anger. Jimmy Carter.